So, 2018 tarot favorites. This is a viewer's request. I wasn't going to do favorites this year. In the past 2 years, my highlights for the year or for the years were my favorites. This year is slightly different. This year is a year of exploration for me, a year of letting go, which is a flow and effect from last year, mid last year onwards. After a very difficult 7 or 8 years of my life, I finally closed a huge chapter in April last year. And after that, I told myself to just chill, to just let loose, to just have fun and enjoy myself and give myself a break. And so I did. I went on sort of various rabbit trails of collecting tarot and of tarot history, of socializing, of just connecting with people for the sake of connecting, socializing and connecting for the sake of collecting, hunting and researching editions and cardstock and publications and years and you name it. And I just basically just went with whatever and followed my nose. And one of those directions which my nose have led me was exploring the boundaries of tarot for myself. So not so much the boundary of tarot, but the boundary of my working with tarot. And so I experimented with various decks, which I normally would not have risked experimenting. And it resulted in an interesting turning points, which reflected in the highlights for this year in 3 decks. The Ophidia Rosa, where there is this sort of triad of poetry, illustration, and tarot archetypes working together, where the tarot illustration actually took a back step, which is very new to me. It's a fascinating way to read. And then the Tarot de Marseille edition Millennium, where the author speculated on an original or lost sacred geometry principle on those woodblock prints. And although I don't buy into that theory for now, it made me think of what could have been. And so my mind went over to what could be in the future, which isn't something I usually do with tarot. And then, of course, in with regards to Carol Hertzer deck, with the energy and the color and the flow of chi that she has on the cards, it took me to a whole other thing altogether. And so really the highlight for me were those experiments. There were lowlights of other kinds of experiments that I don't think it's worth going through, at least not for the moment, but the highlights in terms of tarot are truly represented by those 3 decks. And so what we have here is not so much a highlight, but perhaps favorites. And favorites is always really hard for me to do because I tend to like all of the decks that I work with, and I tend to work with multiple decks. So I always work with several decks in any given time. At any given time, I would do 4, 5, 6 to 7 decks. For the past 4 years, it has been consistently so. So what I have here are decks which sprung to mind when I think back of 2018. And the reason why they stood up are varied, of course. This one here, for example, stood out for me because it gave me comfort. This is the Svatojansky Tarot. But before we start, actually, I would like to show you it's not unwrapped yet, and so this is the Mamluk reproduction of the Mamluk card, which is the oldest surviving playing cards from, I think it's in the area of Egypt somewhere, from the 10th or 11th century. And this is from Cartogram, and Agnes is the lady who I've been dealing with. She's wonderful to deal with. And this year, not only have I bought a birthday present for myself, which I've never ever have done, and I probably will never do again, I've also bought a Christmas present for myself, and this is it. And so I will not be unboxing or unwrapping this until then. And I will probably do a walkthrough of it and a review of it in the coming new year. So that's that. It's already my favorite, even if I haven't opened it, because I know it's going to be truly, truly special. And so this one here comes to my mind the most whenever I look back in 2018, because this is the deck which gave me comfort in a rather trying month of September. Nothing happened to me personally, but there are several bad news arrived in that month back to back within a day of each other. And then there's a variety of happenings around me which served as triggers and which was a very hard reminder that I have yet a lot to work with. Well, that's not true. That I've come a long way in terms of tempering myself, in terms of becoming my own alchemist, in terms of emotional and personal alchemy. I think I've achieved a lot. I've achieved a significant amount of emotional mastery. What I was reminded of was that I shouldn't be complacent. And in September, I was complacent. It started off in June, July, August, September, I was complacent. And I reached out. The one deck I reached out for was this. I don't know why this deck gave me such comfort. The fact that it is a mixture of Marseille and Rider-Waite. Well, it's not Rider-Waite-Smith, but the fact that the pips are, as Robert Place call it, situational. Others call it illustrated pips. I call it scenic pips. So there's scenes, there's stories around the pips rather than just the items, the number of items, 3 coins. There is a whole situation, a whole scene, a whole story happening there. Very much like the Rider-Waite-Smith. And the majors reminds me very much of Tarot de Marseille and a lot of continental European tarot, where they don't shy away from Christian symbology. And I appreciate that. And because, as I mentioned many times, it is extremely hard for me to find a bit of myself looking back at me in tarot decks. Given that I am a minority, not only a minority, but a minority of a particular kind, the only thing that I could cling on to, which make me feel like I exist to other people or that I am not alienated, is Christian and Catholic imageries, as well as conversations around people whose identity is also in the margins, where they are both here and there and neither here nor there, namely people in the LGBTQ community. But that brings me to the next World Tarot here. But before we move on to that, I just want to say that this is so wonderful in terms of the art. It's lino print, I think you call them, a wood block sort of print looking. It's a refreshing combination between the old and almost the new, because of the faces are very apparently people the author know from her life, personal life. And so there is a mixture of a very personal story there, of faces of her parents and family members and loved ones and friends. There is Greek mythology. There is folk tales from her own cultural heritage. There is this atlas here, and then there's stories, biblical stories, which people who grew up Christian or Catholic or who belong to a Judeo-Christian tradition will recognize. I think this is her parents when they were younger, I think. And I like that because it makes me feel welcome. It makes me feel like I'm part of the conversation instead of from the outside looking in. So that's another living person as well that you can see. It's very distinct. The face look like it's, you could just tell, you could just tell. So there's a story around these minors that she explained to me that is actually available in the handbook, but unfortunately the handbook is not available in English. So that's a Svatojansky tarot, one of my absolute favorite, one which gave me such comfort. I reach for over and over again. And so speaking of the identity in terms of feeling like, are you Chinese or are you Indonesian? Yes and no. Are you a Kiwi or are you Indonesian? Yes and no. But you don't look Indonesian, you look Chinese, but you don't look white. Are you really a New Zealander? That kind of questions. And I spend many, many times and many, many moments explaining to people why I'm Chinese, but not quite. And, as soon as people think I'm Chinese, I am directed to or referred to various cultural artifacts, which is very traditional Chinese, which I can't relate to because I'm Peranakan. So a lot of my heritage is a mixture of Chinese and Javanese, and I have to explain to people that just because I look Chinese, it doesn't mean that my heritage, my worldview, my culture is that Chinese. There's another kind of Chinese. There's Chinese diaspora is one thing. I am not even Chinese diaspora. It's diaspora and then some. And then having to explain that you're a Kiwi, but you don't look white. Well, yeah, there's a lot of kinds of New Zealanders, aren't there? And then are you Indonesian? Well, you don't look Indonesian. Are you a Kiwi? Well, you don't look Kiwi. How does a Kiwi look like? Not the bird, but the citizens or the people of New Zealand. And it's this kind of, when you look at somebody, is she female or male? Is he male or female? Is it a she or a he? Something about that echoed the slow holler is another deck that I bonded with really, really well, which I regret selling my spare copy of it for about $40, I can't remember, but 45 or something. I think retail was $50 before shipping when I purchased it. And if you have a spare copy of the slow holler that you're willing to let go for a reasonable price, I'm not going to pay an arm and a leg for it, sorry. Please give me a holler, haha. So this is my absolute favorite, not only because of the sense of identity that I could relate to, even though in my case it's not gender but cultural. There is also a voice that I recognize from my youth, that sense of anger, that sense of wanting to fight the fight and knowing that we must fight the fight. I am less angry now that I'm older. I am entering my 50th year of life. I am still angry, but my anger has a different shape today. But this is very much is a deck that I could identify with very strongly, the Next World Terror. And then, speaking of identity and thinking about who I am and where I come from, this is an oldie but a goodie. This is the edition Truntum, edisi Truntum. I think this is the 3rd edition, and I think this is out of print. Thanks to somebody in one of the Facebook groups that I belong to, I was alerted to the fact that a shop in Vietnam still has stock, and I was selling it at slightly more than retail, but not in an astronomical sort of $100 mark that people have been asking on eBay, which I refuse to pay for. I have the 1st edition. I traded it on Eclectic Terror Forum ages ago for one of my decks, and I was always too scared to use it because this is truly precious to me, because this is only one of 2 tarot decks that has an Indonesian theme that I know of in the world. If you know of any other Indonesian themed tarot deck, please give me a yell, but I don't know of any other ones. This was created by an Indonesian psychologist. I don't know what kind of psychology he practiced, not my kind, definitely. I'm not quite sure what he's about. But he's so afraid of his work being pirated that he is very skittish about reprinting. And seeing how many tarot decks have been pirated out of China, you can see how in Indonesia things are a bit wild west in terms of copyright. I know a couple of artist friends who owned a design company in Indonesia whose client simply took the work and ran with it without paying, and there's nothing they could do about it. It is quite appalling, really. So this is, I could see myself in this. And you see a lot, for example, this is called sword. It's not a sword, it's a kris. And a kris is shorter than a sword. It's like a blade, not a blade, what do you call it? They're reasonably shorter. And if you Google kris, I'll put down below maybe, a link down below. And the people here, the humans here, are a stylized human in the model or in the style of wayang. And wayang is a highly stylized human figures that's often used in shadow puppets. And because of that, they become not particular kind of ethnic group or particular kind of people. They're a symbol of a people. And, I may not look exactly like the people of Indonesia, but half of me or a part of me is came out of that lineage. And you know how it is with genetics, right? You have genotypes and phenotypes, and my phenotypes are my appearance are very East Asian, very Chinese, but in my genes there's a mixture of a variety of things. I don't know what, but it doesn't really matter in what's in the genes. It's really in the mind, in the culture, in the what do you call it, in the worldview, in the belief system, in how we see the world. I'm through and through Peranakan. Very, very Southeast Asian, very Peranakan, a mixture of Chinese and Javanese. And this is a mixture of the variety of ethnic groups across Indonesia represented by their cloth. And you know, I collect batik, I collect Indonesian vintage traditional textiles. This is not just Javanese, this is Balinese over here, and then you have from Toraja, and then you have from Java, and there's a variety. This one here is from further east, around Papua, further east of Indonesia. And Indonesia consists of thousands of ethnic groups, thousands of dialect groups and religion and cultures, and it makes me feel like home. And I have this deck sitting next to me in bed, and sometimes I would wake up feeling a bit stressed about some stuff, and I would just reach for a card and then just look through it, and then I would feel a bit calm, and then I could go back to sleep. So that's the Tarot Nusantara, an Indonesian tarot. We need more of that. I think we need more of these kinds of decks, although some would argue that it's nothing new. It's literally a clone, quote unquote a clone. It's literally a take on Pixie's art with nothing more to contribute, but with you know, nothing more to contribute to the conversation, so to speak. And they would be correct in saying that, but for someone like me, this is so precious because it is the only one deck where I could see my roots reflecting back at me. And then the other one is, of course, well, I don't know why I say of course, but the Oculi Occultati here by Radomil Bogusławski. That's the book. That's you could get this from Scarlet Imprint, and this is strictly Rider-Waite Smith through and through. But the artwork, the cardstock, the lamination, the size, the fact that it doesn't have titles, the fact that the faces are done so beautifully, which is rare in my opinion on tarot decks anyway. The fact that the eyes are closed except for the devil, and the fact that it's close to perfect. It's close to the perfect Rider-Waite Smith deck for me. Size, lamination, cardstock, thickness, artwork, no title. Everybody's eyes are closed and the faces are beautifully drawn, and it even escaped my attention. It didn't register that this is a very masculine deck. Somebody actually pointed it out that there's a lot of male figures here, dominant male figures, and I didn't see those figures in the minors as humans, so I ceased to see them in terms of gender. And some of them look like a child, and you can't really tell whether that's male or female, and it doesn't really matter to me. But if you were to approximate the images, of course, they approximate closer to a human male. But you could argue that in the minors, at least in the case of the minors, a bit like this one here, there is nothing new. Nothing new is added to the conversation. The majors, on the other hand, have a lot more to say that is outside the standard Rider-Waite Smith. And so I find the majors, or working with the majors, only quite enriching. And then if you add the minors into it, it just adds more layer to it. And I absolutely adore this deck. This is one of my absolute favorite in the year. The quartz and the majors have more to say, perhaps, especially the majors. And so with just the color splashes, just single color splashes to indicate elements, very much run along my interest or my being drawn to more colors and more sensual aspect of reading cards this year, with the feeling of the cards, and the beauty of the faces reminds me of prayer, reminds me of sacred silence, where you go into an ancient old Catholic church or a temple, and everything is silent except for the flickering of candle, and yet the air is heavy with sacredness. That is how I feel when I look at these faces, because they are so well done, and because the eyes are all closed like in prayer. So that is my absolute favorite this year in 2018. And then one is an old favorite of mine, which in 2018 have been sitting on my desk around the room somewhere. The Majors Only from Tarot Noir, which is a full deck, but I only use Majors Only. I usually shuffle it like that, and then I just put it on a stand and leave it on whatever landed at the front or whatever landed at the back. I do this, and then it just sit there for a while until I'm ready to shuffle again. So that's a Tarot Noir. This is one of the most well-priced, reasonably priced deck out there. It's huge, it's lovely, it's crisp, the back is beautifully designed, it's gilded. It was like $50 or something with shipping. The box was beautiful. The book, of course, I don't use because it's in French, but apparently it sort of fell apart pretty easily. But I didn't care because it was $50. I think it was $50. I don't know, from my memory, I can't remember, but it was very reasonable. Speaking of a very reasonable deck, this is another deck which I'm very happy with, not only for the quality but the fact that I think I paid $60 shipped to New Zealand. It's heavy, it's large. I usually pay $25 just on shipping. And so this lovely box here, it's interesting that it has a magnet here, because I think the top is actually quite loose. Without the magnet, I think the slit would have slid off. It actually made me wonder about box makers these days, especially in relation to tarot. The sliding sort of lid box like this is usually pretty standard to make. Not that I can, not that I have the skill to do it myself, but from what I know, they're not hard. They're not that they're not hard, but they're pretty common, and they are produced in a large number, very often for a very long time, with reasonable quality. But this is the second such a box that it just slides in and out, and then this one is obviously very loose and assisted with this genius of a solution with the magnet here. Another one I have, and I am very happy with this because it's $50. Another one I have is one of those special edition. I paid $300 for it US. That's a lot of money, and the lid was all wonky, it's misaligned, and it couldn't fit in. Up to this point, I had to squeeze it in, and the joints were not aligned, and that is usually with climate change and humidity change, that the joint would eventually crack when things aren't. I mean, joinery is a skill for a reason. When the joints aren't joined properly, the integrity of the whole item would be compromised over time, and I was very unhappy about that. But anyway, going back to this deck, I backed it on Kickstarter. I backed it for 2 decks, and I was so sure and I love it. I had expected the card to be a bit more like this, so like large and perhaps a little bit more prominent with the line work, but because of the color and because it's a bit smaller, the line work isn't as prominent. However, what it shows is that for a color to shine, for a color to be vivid, to be saturated, and to look really good, you don't necessarily have to have a shiny cardstock or shiny lamination. This is very matte. This is one of those rubbery matte lamination, so that they don't slide against each other as well as others. And there's always a risk of scuffing because it feels like rubber against each other, but it's so beautifully colored. And this is the second deck. This is not the first deck, where I would argue that if people say that vividness of color needed to be accompanied by glossy cardstock, just look at this. And there's another one, which I can't remember which one, but there's another deck where the color is so vivid and the lamination is not at all. Oh, the Millennium tradition, the Tarot de Marseille Millennium Edition. So the gilding is that lovely muted gold. That's the back. The keywords actually, for me, serve as that sort of element of poetry, that third leg in a tripod or in the triad of how I read, which is the story behind the images, and then the word. And then on top of that, of course, is the story from the creator's own worldview. In this case, the book is written by Rachel Pollack, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Rachel Pollack there. And so there's multi-layered of the images, and the story for me is one element. The story of the images, the story of the tarot archetype itself, which is my understanding of, say, the Hierophant or the Pope, for example. So that's two. And then, of course, the third element here for me is the keyword. So work. So I'm not bothered by, say, this means work. The Three of Fire means work. I don't believe in meanings of cards, so I don't see it as work is the meaning of this card. Not at all. For me, it's the meaning of this card for me is the meaning of this card for me based on the story of this card that I can see in the picture and in the words over here. That's one element. Second element is my own take of the Three of Fire, and then third element is the word work. And then I just go from there. I think that's Three of Fire. No, Three of Earth. I think Three of Pentacles. Anyway, so that's the Brady Tarot. I mean, look at how well done is this box and everything, and it's $50 or $60 with shipping to New Zealand, with tracking as well. I'm very impressed. So that's the Brady Tarot. And the other one is, of course, when I say of course, because you've seen me talk about Pablo Robledo's deck here, this is his Dodal. This is his version of the Dodal with this ecru, broken, dark cream background and this sort of neon-like fluorescent, not quite fluorescent, but almost coloring there of the sort of primary color that you usually find in a lot of Marseille decks. This is not cardstock, this is paper stock, but it's one of those delicious paper stock. What I've learned as I collect tarot and as I use many decks over the years is that thick cardstock is brilliant, and I love thick cardstock, but this kind of stock, which is this art paper stock, is not laminated, is also brilliant. And so just because cards aren't made of cardstock doesn't mean that it can't be brilliant. This is an example of it. A lot of Meneghello decks are an example of it. This is supposed to be cardstock, but it's pretty, pretty mediocre. Nothing to write home about. I don't believe you can classify this as cardstock, but it's so amazing. So amazing. So that's that. I've been reading with it, as you know. So that very much feed into my sort of more sensual aspect of reading this year, just the feel of it, the sort of look of it, the feel of it in the hand. And I think this might be last deck here. This is out of print. This is a vintage deck. I think created by, no, actually, I have the Honasa house to show you. So this is Loutre B, or Loutre B, which is pen name for French painter, I believe, and he created this images, I think, this deck. But before we go there, I would like to show you the Honasa house, which is one of my favorites because it pushes the boundary for me in my working with the images, in that it has this feeling before Honasa houses, before this deck. Osvaldo Menegazzi's tarot decks are the only one that gave me that sense of, when I read with his majors, Osvaldo Menegazzi created several decks, majors only. And because he's not a tarot reader, and I think the creator of this deck, at the time of the creation of this deck, wasn't a tarot reader herself. I think she started learning after this. And there is the sense of feeling as if I am tapping into an actual collective unconscious in a way that is closest to how Jung understand the collective unconscious, in that there is this common denominator of understanding across language, across culture, across geographical location, that sort of common denominator of common understanding of looking at somebody across a room, looking at a stranger across a room as we observe a phenomenon, and we both understood exactly what we're looking at. Do you know what I mean? That sense. And I have not had that kind of sense of connection with a creator or with the voice of a creator of a deck, which is mainly what I'm connecting with to work with as I work with these images. To work on myself, I am working with the voices of the creators. The only other deck such as that give me that feeling is Osvaldo Menegazzi's original work. And so this is in Galician, which is quite interesting in itself. The faces of the humans weren't exactly my favorite, which is why I missed out on the first edition. So any of you have the first edition of this one, Honasa House Tarot, please feel free to give me a yell. I may not be prepared to pay you crazy money though, so if you're okay with selling them at a reasonable price, I know it's out of print, please let me know. And so this has been one of those decks that pushes the boundary for me. They didn't quite revolutionize or change the way I read in a way that the 3 decks that I showed you in my 2018 highlight managed to do, but this definitely delivered me closer to it, and it's my absolute classic, instant classic for me. So that's the Honasa House Tarot. This is the 3rd edition. I prefer the back of the 2nd edition, to be honest. And I used to have a spare copy of the 3rd edition, but I've traded it for, I can't remember what for. I hope I won't regret that. So I have a bunch of decks to trade. I wouldn't mind trading for another copy of this particular edition or the other editions if you have. And I'll do a video of decks I have to give away as well as to trade. And so last but not least is the Loutre Be. This I use majors only. This is very, very intuitive, this deck. It is very much like, it has the same feeling as the Honasa House Tarot as well as Tarot by Osvaldo Menegazzi. There's that sense of, I'm not quite sure if the painter actually know how to read tarot or not. It wouldn't surprise me if he doesn't or it didn't. I can't remember if he's still alive. I think he might have passed away. But with a slight twist, so it's a bit like Osvaldo, but a little twist with all the little clues and a little sort of puzzle. Like, for example, strength is number 11 here. So here there is the 10 Roman numeral, and if you draw the line from here all the way down following the dot, that's 11. So that's number 11 for the force, for example. So there's all that sort of little interesting tidbits there. I found this very, very intuitive. So I absolutely love that. It really contributed to my exploring new ways to approach tarot this year. And I was not disappointed. So those are my favorite tarot decks for 2018. Not quite, yeah, favorite. I'll talk to you later. Bye.